In the quiet, suffocating confines of a nameless residence, a man stands at the threshold of a terrible decision, driven by a logic that he insists is the height of sanity. He begins his narrative not with a confession of guilt, but with a defense of his mental acuity. He acknowledges a certain nervousness, a disease that has sharpened his senses rather than destroying them, most notably his sense of hearing. He claims to hear all things in the heaven and the earth, and many things in hell. This hyper-attunement to the world is, in his view, the very antithesis of madness. He presents his tale as a clinical demonstration of his own sagacity, a word he favours to describe the cool, calculated manner in which he approaches the task of murder. The object of his obsession is an elderly man with whom he shares the house. The relationship between them is ostensibly one of peace. The narrator professes an affection for the old man, noting that the elder had never wronged him, nor insulted him, nor provoked any desire for gold or material gain. The motive for the impending violence is entirely metaphysical and sensory. It is centered upon the old man's eye, a pale blue eye, filmed over with a hideous cataract that gives it the appearance of a vulture's eye. To the narrator, this eye is an intrusive, chilling presence. Whenever it falls upon him, his blood runs cold, and his mind recoils in a visceral, instinctive horror. It is the eye, and the eye alone, that he seeks to extinguish. He reasons that by killing the man, he can rid himself of the vulture's gaze forever, thereby restoring his own peace of mind. The narrator's plan is executed with a patience that borders on the supernatural. For 7 consecutive nights, precisely at the stroke of midnight, he turns the latch of the old man's door and opens it with such agonizing slowness that a clock's minute hand would move more quickly. His goal is to thrust his head into the room and peer at the sleeping figure, but more specifically, to catch a glimpse of the evil eye. However, on each of these 7 nights, the old man is found sleeping soundly, his eyes closed. Without the sight of the vulture eye, the narrator finds himself unable to commit the deed. His hatred is directed not at the person of the old man, but at the visual organ that haunts him. Each morning, with a deceptive cheerfulness, he enters the old man's room and inquires after his health, masking his nocturnal surveillance with a mask of perfect normalcy. On the 8th night, the narrator's caution reaches a peak of refinement. He moves even more slowly than before, savouring the feeling of his own power and the extent of his dissimulation. He marvels at the fact that the old man, lying just a few feet away, has no inkling of the dark designs being woven in the silence of the midnight hour. However, as the narrator is about to open the lantern to cast a sliver of light upon the bed, his thumb slips on the tin fastening, making a slight clicking sound. The old man starts up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" The narrator remains perfectly still. For an entire hour he does not move a muscle, standing in the pitch-black doorway while the old man sits upright in his bed, listening. The silence is absolute, yet charged with a mounting tension. The narrator understands the old man's fear. It is the same mortal terror that has often kept him awake in the middle of the night. He hears a low, stifled groan, a sound not of pain or grief, but of a soul overcharged with awe. He knows that the old man has been trying to comfort himself with logical explanations for the noise, the wind in the chimney, a mouse crossing the floor, the chirp of a cricket, but the narrator also knows that these attempts are futile. Death, in the narrator's personification, has entered the room and is standing over the victim. Eventually, the narrator decides to open a tiny, imperceptible crevice in his dark lantern. He directs a single thin ray of light, like the thread of a spider, across the darkness. By a stroke of what he considers fate, the ray falls precisely upon the vulture eye. It is wide open, staring back at him with a hideous, veiled blue that chills him to the bone. He cannot see the man's face or body, only that damned spot of an eye. At this moment, his heightened hearing begins to play a crucial role. He perceives a low, dull, quick sound, much like the sound a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. He recognizes it as the beating of the old man's heart. The sound increases the narrator's fury. He compares it to the beating of a drum that stimulates a soldier into courage. He fears that the sound is so loud it might be heard by a neighbor through the thin walls of the house. The anxiety of being discovered, coupled with the intolerable sight of the eye, drives him to the final act. With a loud yell, he throws open the lantern and leaps into the room. The old man shrieks once. The narrator drags him to the floor and pulls the heavy bed over him, stifling the life out of him. He watches as the heart continues to beat for several minutes with a muffled sound, but it does not trouble him now, for it cannot be heard from the street. Finally, the beating ceases. The old man is dead. The narrator examines the corpse, placing his hand over the heart to ensure there is no pulsation. The eye is closed, and the source of his torment is gone. What follows is a meticulous account of the narrator's efforts to conceal the crime, which he offers as further proof of his sanity. He works in the dead of night, dismembering the body in a large tub to ensure that no bloodstain reaches the floor. He then removes 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposits the remains in the space beneath. He replaces the board so cleverly and so cunningly that no human eye, not even his own, could detect any disturbance. There is no debris, no mess, and no evidence of the struggle. He is triumphant in his sagacity. At 4 o'clock in the morning, as the bells chime the hour, there is a knock at the front door. The narrator, feeling a sense of light-hearted invincibility, goes to open it. 3 police officers enter, explaining that a neighbor had reported hearing a shriek during the night, leading to a suspicion of foul play. The narrator smiles, welcoming them with an air of perfect ease. He explains that the shriek was his own, uttered in a dream, and that the old man is away in the country. He leads the officers through the house, inviting them to search every corner. He shows them the old man's treasures, secure and undisturbed. In a fit of wild audacity, the narrator brings chairs into the very room where the murder occurred. He encourages the officers to sit and rest from their fatigues, while he himself places his own chair directly over the spot where the body is concealed. The officers are satisfied. His manner has convinced them of his innocence. They sit and chat about familiar things, and the narrator responds with easy cheerfulness. However, after a time, he begins to feel himself growing pale. He wishes the men would leave. His head aches, and he perceives a ringing in his ears. The ringing persists and becomes more distinct. He talks more fluently, more loudly, trying to drown it out, but the sound continues to gain definitiveness. He soon realizes that the noise is not within his ears. It is a low, dull, quick sound, much like a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. It is the same sound he heard before the murder, the beating of the heart. The narrator's agitation grows. He gasps for breath, talks faster, and raises his voice in an attempt to ignore the rhythmic thumping. He paces the floor with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, but the noise steadily increases. He wonders how the officers cannot hear it. He becomes convinced that they do hear it, that they are aware of his guilt and are merely mocking him with their continued pleasantries and smiles. He finds their hypocritical smiles more intolerable than the sound itself. The contrast between the calm, professional demeanour of the police and the escalating cacophony in his own mind becomes unbearable. He feels he must scream or die. The sound grows louder, louder, louder. Finally, unable to endure the agony of his own conscience, or what he perceives as the externalized sound of his crime, he breaks. He shrieks the truth at the officers, telling them to tear up the planks and look beneath. He confesses to the deed, pointing to the floorboards and crying out that it is the beating of his hideous heart. The summary of the story reveals a profound exploration of the nature of guilt and the fragility of the human psyche. The third-person perspective allows for an objective viewing of a man who is entirely subjective in his assessment of reality. The narrator's insistence on his sanity is the very thing that underscores his madness. He mistakes his obsessive-compulsive precision and his sensory overload for intellectual superiority. The vulture eye serves as a symbol for a perceived external judgment or a flaw in the world that the narrator cannot tolerate. The irony of the conclusion lies in the fact that the very sense he boasted of, his acute hearing, becomes the instrument of his downfall. Whether the sound of the heart was a genuine auditory hallucination born of guilt or a manifestation of his own racing pulse, it serves as an inescapable reminder of the life he extinguished. The story concludes not with the triumph of the narrator's sagacity, but with the total collapse of his facade under the weight of a conscience he claimed not to possess. Throughout the narrative, the themes of time and surveillance are central. The narrator's obsession with the midnight hour and the rhythmic beating of the heart, likened to a watch, suggests a man trapped in a mechanical ticking universe where every second brings him closer to a reckoning. His surveillance of the old man mirrors the surveillance he eventually feels from the police and the eye itself. The house, which should be a place of sanctuary, becomes a psychological prison. The objective view of the narrator's actions shows a man who has meticulously constructed a tomb for himself, believing all the while that he was building a monument to his own cleverness. The characters are minimal, yet their roles are stark. The old man is a passive victim, representing innocence, or perhaps the inevitable decay of age that the narrator fears. The police officers represent the social order and the external world, their calm presence acting as a foil to the narrator's internal chaos. The narrator himself is a study in contradiction, a man who loves his victim but hates his eye. A man who is calm in the act of murder, but hysterical in the presence of peace. A man who believes he has hidden his crime perfectly, only to shout it from the rooftops. In the end, the narrative serves as a cautionary tale about the impossibility of escaping one's own mind. The narrator's attempt to separate the man from the eye fails because the act of violence is an assault on the self as much as it is on the other. The telltale nature of the heart is not merely a Gothic flourish, but a psychological truth. That which is buried, be it a body or a secret, has a way of making itself heard. The objective summary of these events paints a picture of a man undone by the very heightened senses he believed made him superior, proving that the greatest threat to a criminal is often not the law, but the inescapable resonance of their own pulse. The meticulousness with which the narrator approaches his task is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the account. He describes the wise precautions he took, emphasizing that no madman could have been so careful. This fixation on the process rather than the morality of the act suggests a profound detachment from human empathy. He views the dismemberment of the body as a logistical challenge to be solved with so much cleverness, showing a total lack of remorse or even recognition of the humanity of his victim. To him, the old man's body is merely a collection of parts to be managed, and the floorboards are a convenient storage solution. This clinical coldness is what makes the final breakdown so significant. The return of the sound represents the return of the repressed emotional and moral reality that he tried so hard to dismantle. The setting of the story, though sparsely described, is essential to its atmosphere. The darkness of the chamber, the blackness as thick as tar, creates a sensory vacuum where the narrator's internal state can expand and overwhelm him. The lantern, which he uses to control the light, is a tool of his perceived power, allowing him to see without being seen. However, when the light finally falls on the eye, it becomes a spotlight on his own obsession. The house itself, with its thin walls and echoing silence, becomes a character in the drama, amplifying the sounds that the narrator fears and ultimately reflecting his own fractured state back at him. The police officers, in their brief appearance, serve to ground the story in a social reality. They are not characters with depth, but symbols of the inevitability of discovery. Their presence in the room, their casual conversation, and their lack of suspicion create a tension that the narrator cannot sustain. The contrast between their perceived ignorance and the narrator's certainty that they are dissembling is the climax of his paranoia. He projects his own guilt onto them, transforming their polite behavior into a cruel mockery. This projection is the final stage of his psychological disintegration, where the boundary between his internal thoughts and the external world completely vanishes. The sound of the heart, described as a low, dull, quick sound, is the central motif of the story's conclusion. It is a rhythmic, persistent force that cannot be silenced by walls or floorboards. It represents the persistence of life, the weight of the deed, and the narrator's own mortality. By identifying the sound as the beating of his hideous heart, the narrator finally acknowledges that the source of the noise is internal. Whether it is his own heart racing in panic or the spectral heart of his victim, it is an inescapable part of his being. The telltale heart is ultimately his own, betraying his secrets to the world, and ending his quest for a peace that was founded on violence. In the final analysis, the story is a masterpiece of psychological tension and narrative control. By summarizing it from an objective third-person perspective, the underlying structure of the narrator's madness is laid bare. We see the progression from obsession to action, from triumph to terror. The narrator's sagacity is revealed to be a fragile mask for a deep-seated instability, and his acute senses are shown to be the very tools of his destruction. The story remains a definitive exploration of the dark corners of the human mind, where logic and madness are often indistinguishable to the one who possesses them. The narrator's initial plea for the listener to hearken and observe how healthily How calmly he can tell the story is the ultimate irony. By the end of the narrative, he is neither healthy nor calm. He is a man screaming his guilt in a room full of people he believes are laughing at him. The vulture eye may be gone, but it has been replaced by a sound that he can never stop hearing. The objective summary of this descent into madness highlights the terrifying speed with which a mind can turn upon itself when it attempts to justify the unjustifiable. The story stands as a testament to the power of conscience and the inescapable nature of truth, even when buried deep beneath the floorboards of the mind. As the officers stood in the room, the narrator's internal monologue, though not directly spoken, was written in every frantic movement of his body. He had thought himself a master of his environment, a man who could control light and sound, life and death. He had orchestrated a perfect crime, or so he believed. But the perverseness of the human spirit, a theme often explored in such narratives, ensured that he would be his own accuser. The very intellect he used to hide the body was the same intellect that manufactured the sound of the heart to punish him. The objective reality was a quiet room with 4 men. The narrator's reality was a cacophony of rhythmic thunder and mocking smiles. This disconnect is the essence of his tragedy. The old man, in his final moments, likely felt a terror that was equal to the narrator's madness. The groan of mortal terror was a shared experience between the victim and the victimizer, a moment of profound connection in the darkness. The narrator's claim that he knew what the old man felt and pitied him is a chilling example of his distorted empathy. He felt the old man's fear not as a reason to stop, but as a validation of his own feelings. This shared terror is what eventually manifests as the beating heart. The narrator cannot kill the old man's fear because it is also his own. When he stifles the old man, he is attempting to stifle his own anxiety, but the telltale sound proves that such a feat is impossible. The final scene, with the narrator pointing at the floorboards, is a moment of total surrender. He gives up the sagacity he prized so highly in exchange for the relief of confession. The weight of the secret had become heavier than the floorboards themselves. In his mind, the officer's silence was the ultimate weapon, a derision that forced him to speak. Whether they actually heard anything or suspected anything is irrelevant. The narrator's own mind had already convicted him. The story ends at the moment of peak intensity, leaving the reader with the image of a man broken by the very senses he thought would save him. This summary reflects the cold, dark world inhabited by the narrator. It strips away his justifications and reveals the mechanical, almost clockwork progression of his crime and subsequent collapse. The vocabulary used, words like sagacity, dissimulation, and audacity, mirrors the narrator's own self-important language, but places it in a context that emphasizes his delusion. The sentence structure reflects the rhythmic driving nature of the story, building in tension until the final inevitable outburst. In the end, the tale is not just about a murder, but about the nature of the human heart itself, how it can be driven to darkness by the smallest of triggers, and how it can never truly hide from its own actions. The vulture eye was merely a catalyst for a deeper, more fundamental instability. The narrator's journey from the calculated opening of a door to the frantic tearing up of floorboards is a complete arc of psychological ruin. The objective observation of this arc provides a chilling look at the fragility of the human mind and the enduring power of the moral sense, however distorted it may become. The telltale heart beats for everyone who has ever tried to bury a truth, reminding them that some sounds can never be muffled.